London, met everyone, and welcome to our migration history seminar. We've been running this all of the academic year. This is the penultimate session, and I echo what was said in the chat. I hope you can join us for our last session as well. We've built up a nice audience. We have a good discussion. It's very friendly, very helpful. So it's great to see you all here. I'm not going to say a thing about the paper because I'm going to pass over to my co-convener, Anna Maguire, who is going to chair this session. Anna, the floor is all yours, and thank you very much.
Thank you, John, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome for this afternoon's seminar a former colleague and a dear friend, Dr. Priya Atwal, who is a historian and author who has written and researched on subjects of empire, monarchy and cultural politics, particularly across Britain and South Asia. She obtained her PhD at the University of Oxford, where she now holds a post as a Community History Fellow. And I know that Priya is going to think about the relationship between the migration history that she's researching in this project and its public history implications in this evening's paper. Her first book, the very wonderful Royals and Rebels, The Rise and Fall of the Sikh Empire, was published by Hurst in 2020 at a very reasonable price for an academic book because of its aim for a broad audience. So it uncovers the story of the powerful women and overlooked children who forged a dynasty to rival the Mughals and the British in the competitive world of 19th century Indian politics. In this evening's paper, we're going to be hearing from Priya's new research project, which is using migration as a kind of conceptual framework to think about monarchy and exile in new forms. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Priya to start this evening's paper. If you could just pop any questions that you have in the chat at the end of the talk, just to save any distractions, that would be great. And there'll also be opportunities to ask your question on camera at the end. But for now, let's hand over to Priya.
Thank you very much, Anna and Don, for that very warm and very kind welcome. And it's nice to be joining you on your birthday eve, Anna, at this seminar. I had to drop that in there, sorry, mate. But I'm really chuffed to be joining all of you. And I would dearly appreciate any help and advice on some of the ideas that I'm going to share for this work in progress project today. I'd love to receive your comments and questions in the chat, as I'm still at quite an early stage of figuring out what I'm doing with this project. So if I just very quickly share my slides, and I'm learning how to use Blackboard today, so hopefully this works again, just as well as it worked earlier on. I hope everyone can see that. Yep, Anna's nodding, thank you very much. Okay, so in my paper today, I'll be talking about the ties between Queen Victoria and this group of young people. So from left to right, top to bottom, we have top left Maharajah Duleep Singh of the Sikh Empire of Punjab. Next, to the right of him is Prince Alamayu of Abyssinia. Then the little baby in the corner is Albert Victor Pomare, who is the child of the Maori chieftain, former Maori chieftain Harry Pomare, his father, who's gazing down at him. Then if we pop to the left is Princess Gouramma of Korg, and across to the right is Sarah Forbes Bonetta, a young Yoruba, daughter of a Yoruba chief who was given as a hostage to Queen Victoria. And in the centre is the British royal family, Queen Victoria's husband and children. So these figures all hailed from 19th century royal or chiefly families from across South Asia, Africa and Australasia. And many of them were displaced or dispossessed by the expansion of the British Empire, headed of course by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert in this period. Now, all of these young characters became either wards of the British state and or godchildren of Queen Victoria during the period between 1850 and 1868, midway through Queen Victoria's reign. Now, they've drawn increasing attention individually in the UK and around the world, and throughout diasporic communities, but I want to think about them as a collective today. I'm not the first to do so, as in a 2016 essay on the personal and political engagement of Queen Victoria with her burgeoning empire, the historian Barbara Kane, as referenced here, characterised Victoria's relations with these young wards as being emblematic of the imagined construction of an imperial rather than merely royal family. Kane briefly drew out the significance of these relationships in her essay, acknowledging the element of romantic Orientalism involved in the manner that Victoria portrayed these young colonial wards, but also making an important point about how her concern for their welfare provided a valuable means through which she could also further her interest in the colonized territories from whence they originated. Now, I want to dive much more deeply into this and its implications. Perhaps when we think about the idea of an imperial family, Queen Victoria's imperial family, we might think of images like this one. This is a late 19th century depiction of her extensive European family, iconically produced by Lauritz Regner Tuxen in 1887. And the Queen commissioned Tuxen to paint this grand dynastic portrait to mark the gathering of her family at Windsor Castle for her Golden Jubilee, which celebrated 50 years of her reign. And she's seated right in the center of the scene here with a few probably great grandkids in her lap. Her imperially titled children and grandchildren dutifully posing around the grandmother of Europe. However, in this paper, I'm interested in looking beyond Victoria's relationships with her European royal kin, or at least setting these ties within a broader global context that she herself was increasingly shaping during the course of her reign. I'm really interested in these transnational royal networks and royal agency within them. I want to share with you today my thoughts on that other imperial family that I talked about just now, and potentially to think about what it means to conceptualize them as an imperial family. A family that Victoria arguably began constructing from the 1850s onwards, alongside raising her own children. And so these two families, and I'll use that term again very loosely, intersect and overlap in very intriguing ways. So we go back to our royal wards. I'm interested in digging deeper into the nature of the relationships that Kane describes between these young people and Queen Victoria, to an extent supporting her thesis about the emergence of a so-called imperial family in the Victorian era, considering also that many of these young people became godchildren of Queen Victoria's, but also connecting this more critically with some new ideas about royal political thought from this period, centering particularly around notions of the value of so-called royal blood and transnational royal relations. One question that I seek to ask about this is how and why did Queen Victoria become so interested in taking such young foreign royalty under her wing in this period? And in the process, she creates entirely new relations with non-European elites to those that her predecessors had maintained. There's a degree of closeness that comes in this period that had never existed to the same extent before. And I want to ask, what does this tell us about the reframing of dynastic and monarchical rule in the 19th century? And alongside this, the new imperatives that were influencing transnational royal movement during this period of significant change. So looking at these figures as migrants, but also looking at them as global icons in some respect. And I'm going to focus predominantly on Queen Victoria's views on this today. I would love to dive deeper into the perspectives and ideas and experiences of these individual young people. But my research is still ongoing on them, and I've only got so much time today. So I'm more than happy to take questions on that in the Q&A later, but I'll give a snippet wherever I can of their voices and perspectives. And why focus on all this anyway, right? I mean, what has this got to do with migration history, perhaps? Well, I think firstly, we also need to put royal history more critically on the agenda when it comes to topics of global inequality and also of migration politics. Serious questions about the monarchy and its role in connections with empire and race and migration are not asked often enough, especially not in the public domain. Obviously, at the moment, I'm quite interested to see how this is making headlines. And I'm also taking a great, with the current royal visit to the Caribbean and this really quite grim photograph that's been doing the rounds on Twitter just today about Kate Middleton, the Duchess of Cambridge, meeting young Jamaican people through a barbed wire fence. It's just quite horrific to look at. But I'm also taking my cue from a really timely and fantastic piece of work, Laura Clancy's book, Running the Family Firm, who has quite pointedly in her last paragraph of the book made the claim that, made the argument that we just cannot talk about the history of inequality in Britain and around the world without talking about the monarchy. So we really need to rethink the role of the monarchy and its representation within history, sociology, and politics more broadly again. Not with a view to just rehashing what the royals have been up to, but thinking about their implication in wider politics, nationally and globally, and imperially. And so what I'm trying to argue today is that perhaps, you know, finding a way to investigate the status of the imperial wards that I'm talking about and the nature of their ties with the British royal family can hopefully be quite instructive for us in understanding how people of colour have been historically co-opted into and configured in relation to the monarchy and its global power. Did I want to say something else there? I think I'll leave it for now. But yeah, so this is what I'm trying to focus on today. So just to break this down in terms of chronology, to give you a brief, you know, potted biography of these young people and where they came from. Sarah Bonetta Forbes, as I mentioned, was from a group of elites, a family of elites of Yoruba heritage, who themselves were essentially displaced by the King of Dahomey in West Africa. And she was given as a hostage, as a potential slave, to Queen Victoria, initially to Captain Forbes, who was a British naval officer who was involved in diplomacy in that region, but then via Forbes, given as a gift, essentially, to Queen Victoria in 1850. She was only 8 years old at the time, and she was baptized as a Christian on board the ship that brought her to the UK. And she and then later her daughter, also known as Victoria, were made the godchildren of Queen Victoria, and her education and her upbringing thereafter on her arrival in Britain was paid for by Queen Victoria. Shortly thereafter, 2 years later, Princess Gouramma from the South Indian state of Coorg, also at a similar sort of age, 8 or 9 years old, 10 or 11 years old, what am I talking about, is brought over to Britain. And she is brought over by her father, explicitly, the former Rajah of Coorg, who was seeking to launch a campaign against the East India Company for unpaid state debts to his former kingdom, which he failed miserably in achieving. But he also cherished a wish, very interestingly, for Victoria, who he regarded as an empress, to adopt his favorite child, his youngest daughter, and to raise her as a English noblewoman, essentially, and to ensure that she married into an English aristocratic family. And in doing so, he willingly gave up his daughter to be baptized into the Christian faith, and again taken on as a godchild of Queen Victoria's. So it's interesting that in the first two instances, it's two young girls that are taken under Victoria's wing. But thereafter, it's all boys. 1854 is the arrival of Maharajah Duleep Singh. Duleep Singh was a bit older. He was 16 when he came to Britain, and he was the former sovereign of the Sikh Empire in the Punjab, which was annexed by the East India Company in 1849. And so Duleep Singh came over as a deposed king, a young deposed king. He had separately, independently converted to Christianity in 1852, which is not a story not without its own controversy. But he landed up in Britain wanting to come here on an educational tour, and Queen Victoria really actively ushered him into her royal court. And it's actually his position in the court that I'm going to focus on the most today, because we have the most evidence and archives about him. But there's, I think, broader points to be drawn in parallel with some of these other figures. To move things along, 1863 was when Albert Victor Pomare was born. He was the little baby that we saw in the previous slides. His parents were visiting Queen Victoria at Windsor Castle on a kind of a orchestrated tour of Maori elites to Britain from New Zealand. And he was quite literally in the womb when he met Queen Victoria. And she explicitly turned to his parents and said that I would like to be the godmother of your child. So this was something that she actively engaged in at this point. And duly, the parents, gave permission, and he was named after both the deceased Prince Albert, but also Queen Victoria. And last but not least, Prince Alamayu was again, another deposed former royal from the Abyssinian Empire. He and his family were quite violently removed from the throne in their homeland, and Alamayu particularly was quickly removed from the country after his father was killed, in order to not enable him to be used as another pawn to be put back on the throne as a potential independent ruler. And again, Queen Victoria is documented as, you know, directly expressing an interest to take him under her wing. Now, Alamayu did not live very long. He lived quite a sad and you know, a difficult life in Britain, and also potentially partly in India. And he died only at the age of about 18. And he's actually buried at Windsor Castle at the St George's Chapel on the orders of Queen Victoria. So all of them have this very close knit association with the British royal family, but one that is not fraught, not entirely, you know, devoid of power politics over here. And what I kind of, you know, would love for everyone's help with here and to think through with you today is, they're all clearly elites, and they're all very interesting characters and very difficult stories in their own right. But what I find is that it's somewhat difficult to ascertain what kind of title or label to use to refer to these individuals, to accurately describe their migratory or legal status. Yes, they were royals. Yes, they were chiefs. They're elites. But are they refugees? Are they emigres? Are they migrants, hostages, exiles, guests, wards? What should we call them? All of these terms and more, perhaps, can be used to describe these figures at different points of their lives, as they made their way from their countries of origin, or were quite, you know, actively displaced from them, as they made their way from those countries to the British metropole and to other foreign nations or imperial territories. As wards of the British state, they were hardly free in their movements, much of which was determined by treaties specific to their kingdoms or their families, or according to political policy. Yet, on the other hand, as recognized elites, they were ostensibly supported to live in rather privileged socioeconomic circumstances. And this is based on understandings of their royal blood, as I'm going to talk about shortly in relation to Duleep Singh. Just briefly, and we can come back to this later, and maybe I should have mentioned this earlier on actually, but what is interesting is how several of these figures are now increasingly being reclaimed and relabeled specifically as hostages or as stolen children in popular historical narratives or in diasporic political discourse. Maharajah Duleep Singh and Prince Alamayu are two particularly contested figures in this regard. And in the past decade, debates have been ignited centering on both their memory and on their bodily remains, as campaigns have been kicked off to have their remains exhumed and repatriated. And all this reclaiming is centered around the representation that these two former royal figures were stolen or kidnapped as young boys and forcibly prevented from returning to their homelands so as to extinguish their independent sovereignty. My next book project is going to focus on Duleep Singh, and I'm aware that a colleague of mine, Christian Crouch, is working on a book project about Alamayu and his family, which is known quite interestingly as Queen Victoria's captives. But as I'm finding with my research, and as I want to play out today, is that, the historical reality of the lives of these young figures is often much more complex and nuanced, as well as their engagement with the British royal family, than such popular nostalgic narratives may allow. And I'm going to be very interested to see, once I'm further along with this research, how audiences and community historians engage with this kind of research finding, and what I can learn from them too. So as I mentioned, my archival research on this is quite an early stage, but this is another question I want to throw out to everybody. If I just pop back to my timeline slide, and I think some of this comes from this broader sort of sense that I'm trying to get is, while popular attention has focused on individual figures, I think there is something to gain and something for us to rethink by viewing all of these young people as a group, as a collective, and then thinking about what that means for the history of diasporic communities and migration to the UK, as well as for the royal family. There's also the question of religion here, and I'm going to touch upon all this very lightly today. They were all exclusively Christian converts, amongst, in many ways, the first from their family backgrounds or their cultural backgrounds in many of the countries that they were from an elite group to convert to Christianity. So there are both imperial, racial and religious connotations all tied up in Victoria's symbolic and practical embrace of these young people that I think we really need to pay more attention to. Okay, so that's my kind of top line view of all of this, and I will come back to some of this a bit later. But I want to drill down into the practical ways in which some of these questions and issues played out by focusing specifically now on the case study of Maharajah Duleep Singh. And I think we can scrutinize these matters most easily through an analysis of the manner in which the Maharaja was incorporated into the British Royal Court from 1854. As the longest living and most socially and politically prominent of all of Queen Victoria's wards, we have the most extensive documentation available about him and his life, including voluminous records that exist at the Royal Archives, which give us an extremely helpful insight into his standing within Victoria's courtly circle and wider imperial society. So this on screen is a sketch that Victoria completed of the Maharaja in her private journal, and she was just absolutely taken by him. But what's more important here as well is not just how she was just taken up by his Indian glamour, but also the fact that she actively pushed to have him visit her in the first place.
Wait a minute, no, not 10 years. Yeah, almost 10 years later. So this is a huge interval now to have, followed really.
Someone's got their sound on. Sorry.
I think that's stopped now, Priya. Sorry about that. If we can just make sure that everyone's on mute, then please carry on. Thank you.
I hope that was an interesting thought on the dates, but I don't know. Anyway, so back to Duleep Singh. So just a quick refresher. His North Indian Empire was taken over by the East India Company in 1849 when he was just 10. By the age of 14, he was one of the first two Indian royal figures who had converted to Christianity, the other being Princess Gouramma, who I'll come back to a bit later. In 1854, the 16-year-old Duleep Singh arrived in England for his educational tour, as I mentioned, during which time he was actively welcomed into the inner circle of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Now, unlike Gouramma, he was a ward of the company, not directly of the Queen. However, he similarly developed a close relationship with the British royal family, who acted as semi-guardians towards him during his early life in England, particularly after he chose to settle there in the countryside, rather than attempting to return to India after the 1857 rebellion. Queen Victoria later became godmother to two of his children and remained his close friend and private political well-wisher for much of his adult life, even discreetly when he went into rebellion. The case study of Duleep and Victoria's relationship, I will argue, enables us to view the global and imperial social order from the perspective of the British royals, and to see how their ideas played out within their own courtly arena. The evidence that I want to explore here, sourced as I mentioned from the Royal Archives, suggests that Victoria and her key advisors held their own views about the manner in which categories of race, class, and religion interlinked, based upon their personal understandings of how special types of blood could undercut such boundaries, and thereby influence the treatment that an individual could expect to receive within society. And even more importantly and crucially here is just how they managed to push forward the relevance of their own views over and above other authority figures in British society. So what I want to unpack is also the significance of courtly influence, the ongoing significance of courtly influence on debates about migration and status in the UK. So what I want to highlight now is how notions of royal blood, overlapping with the privileging of Christian royalty, embodied in the debate about how to receive Duleep Singh within Queen Victoria's residences, may help to reveal an independent vision within the Victorian court about the role of royal status and dynastic authority in the rapidly changing world of the 19th century. So let's break this down. I've got some letters from the Royal Archives that kind of start to show us this. Now, prior to the Maharaja's arrival in Britain, the Queen asked for inquiries to be made to determine the appropriate courtly status to be accorded to Duleep Singh so that he could then be invited to meet her at Buckingham Palace. She was just desperate to meet him. Okay, so we see the excitement with the painting that she did in her diary just there. But she was on it to get him to visit, basically. and she tasked her private secretary months before he came, several weeks before he came, Charles Phipps, his name was, Colonel Charles Phipps, to conduct this research. The question was certainly a novel one, as although several elite Indian visitors had been presented to the Queen before 1854, Duleep was the first Maharaja to visit the country, and these discussions went on over several weeks and became quite complex, because nobody in royal circles was able to say with certainty how such a figure was to be assimilated into standard courtly protocol. However, Victoria was fascinated with all that she had heard about the Sikh Empire through dispatches and private correspondence with senior company officials, and she was determined, therefore, to meet the young Maharaja in person. Now, this quote here comes from a memorandum that Phipps put together of notes and questions about this issue, and it provides an insightful example of how an attempt was made to translate Indian royal status to fit within European convention, within which class, religion, lineage, law, and political history were all bound up in interesting ways. Poor Phipps was rather perplexed about what to do with the Maharaja, although it is evident from his comments here that he and the court were keen to treat Duleep Singh very hospitably. A debate would, however, ensue amongst high-ranking British ministers about whether encouraging such fraternization between the Queen and a deposed Indian ruler was really appropriate. And within this, how should Duleep Singh personally be viewed? As a British subject or something else? What strikes me as most interesting about this debate is how blood, rather than class or race, would be seen as a discursive issue and a signifier of social boundaries. Now, we see this issue being implicitly raised within Phipps's writing here, when he hints at the importance of Duleep Singh's royal birth and lineage as the heir and successor of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. It was for this reason, the Maharaja's royal blood, that Phipps expresses concern that it would be unseemly to make him walk about in a crowd of ordinary people. I mean, says doesn't give much room for all of us, eh? But there we go. The consultations now about the Maharaja's courtly status were extended to include Lord Aberdeen, the then Prime Minister. Aberdeen effectively portrayed the Maharaja as a stateless individual rather than a British subject. And again, I find that interesting. He asserts that the treaty governing Duleep Singh's movements and entitlements included, and I quote, conditions which appear to be rather at variance with the character of a subject, and in some degree to recognize a species of independence, end quote. As such, the Prime Minister curiously suggested that the Maharaja was such a liminal figure that he stood outside of the laws of both Britain and the British Indian Empire. Aberdeen instead placed him in the distinct category of a deposed or abdicated sovereign, and in other places in this letter he compared him to Napoleon. And he saliently proposed that his fortunes could therefore be shaped at will by, I quote again, personal predilection or political motives. He explained to the Queen that much would depend on the circumstances of the case as to how any such figure ought to be treated, and he clarified that in certain situations, I quote, a deposal or abdication might justify the absence of royal distinctions, end quote, or alternatively, if the deposed individual's terms were to be interpreted, again quoting, by anyone favourably disposed, who took into view the indelible nature of the royal attributes, the same deference and respect would necessarily be paid as to the incognito of reigning sovereigns. Okay, what does he mean by this? In his reference to the indelible nature of royal attributes, Aberdeen, like Phipps earlier, is making a subtle reference to Duleep Singh's royal blood and the importance that this would ordinarily carry in questions of social status. He recommended that the Queen, therefore, treat Duleep Singh as a foreign prince in whom she took an interest. Now, I want to carry on unpacking the significance of this, but a journal entry written by Victoria shortly afterwards shows that she was delighted by this suggestion and thought that it coincided exactly with her views, that she see him as a prince of the royal blood and someone in whom she could take an interest. And thereafter, Duleep Singh became a regular fixture, a regular guest at intimate royal dinners, and was even invited to go on holiday with the Queen's immediate family to their private retreat at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. So this idea of the royal incognito, the princes in whom she could take an interest, is actually not a new one by any means, even for Queen Victoria. It's one that carried great political import, arguably. Victoria had deployed this kind of logic to extend invitations to many European royals before Duleep's arrival at her court in July 1854 for her own political reasons. Indeed, the first royal to have come to her court via the Punjab was not actually Duleep Singh, but a cadet Prussian prince, Waldemar, who is seen on the left here, whom she and Albert invited to stay with them for a month in 1848. After hearing reports of his travels in the region during the First Anglo-Sikh War of 1845-46, which temporarily deposed the 7-year-old Duleep Singh from his throne. Now, Waldemar was awarded a royal honour for his role in the conflict, which was actually pretty rubbish, but I'll explain about that later. And he was quizzed by the Queen and Prince Consort about his experiences in India when he visited in 1848. And in that same year, a fresh war broke out in the Punjab that eventuated with the company pulling Duleep Singh off his throne. But of course, 1848 was not just revolutionary in the Punjab. It was the same year in which anti-royal revolutions and pro-democratic movements erupted throughout Europe, shaking the dynastic rule of many of Queen Victoria's friends and relations throughout the continent. So she and Albert thereafter willingly provided sanctuary to the Prussian crown prince and his wife, and ended up giving a long-term home to the deposed King Louis Philippe of France. And to take us full circle, in the same week that Victoria met Duleep Singh by 1854, she was also playing host to her cousin Pedro V of Portugal, whose family had themselves barely survived several anti-royalist campaigns in that few years. And Albert thereafter took him under his wing, Pedro in the middle, to coach him into promoting constitutional monarchy in southwestern Europe as a means of survival. So essentially, these royal migrants are coming back and forth throughout the British royal court, and they're being received with open arms. And clearly there was a well-established routine for welcoming and identifying wandering or displaced royal figures to bring them into the fold of the Victorian royal court. And within this, Victoria clearly had her own views about the meaning or value of royal blood, and the fact that she felt it should be able to convey on royal individuals an extra layer of protection and dignity over and above what an ordinary person could expect to be given. And within this, they should be allowed the right to have unrestricted passage across borders, as well as to receive the right to sanctuary, privilege, and respect in other countries. We can see within this worldview that it was considered to be indelibly a part of the royal individual's body through their blood, which is not supposed to be, even interestingly, I think here, not changing or affected by any external political events, thereby remaining of the same superior nature, whether the individual was traveling abroad incognito for a royal tour or holiday, or even after they had been deposed and stripped of their sovereign powers, as you see with Louis Philippe or with Duleep Singh. And as we shall see, she selectively only utilised the advice of those ministers who supported these views, so as to ensure that she could easily interact with fellow royals as and when she chose. And going back to the wards that I was talking about earlier, this title of foreign prince in whom she takes an interest is really applied in the case of Prince Alamayu and then her Maori godson, Albert Victor. So, we see this happening in this quote here, produced by one of Alamayu's temporary guardians, about how Victoria kind of intervenes as a saviour patron of this orphaned Abyssinian prince to actively reach out to him via telegraph and pull him out of Egypt and say, right, bring him to England and bring him to my court. And thereafter, she intervenes in his education and provides for his care by British guardians. And as I mentioned, when he dies, she orders for his body to be buried at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Albert Victor, on the other hand, the Maori baby godson, as I mentioned, was just in the womb when she met him. But later on, he goes back with his parents to New Zealand. And it's interesting in his case, I'm still reading the letters at the Royal Archives, and I'm on a cliffhanger. I'm waiting to get another date to go back to see what happens to him. because we don't actually know what happens for the rest of his life. But what I had read so far is that, Albert goes back to New Zealand with his parents, and supposedly his father, Harry Pomare, absconded. And we don't know why. I don't 100% know why. And his mother was deemed to be unfit to look after him by a group of Christian missionaries who were really invested in the idea of Albert as the Queen's godchild, and therefore an icon to further this missionary activity in New Zealand. And they write letters directly to Victoria's courtiers to tell her that his father had disappeared, and to claim that the missionary community should be allowed to take charge of Albert. And in this instance, we see this correspondence between Sir Thomas Biddulph, who was again one of Queen Victoria's private secretaries, with one of the ladies of the bedchamber, Catherine Bruce, who'd received this letter from these colonial missionaries, who was saying, this is a real headache. I wish that the Queen had left this child alone, because by this point, she's got her fingers in so many pies with all these young wards. And what was having to happen now is that the Queen was going to be privately paying for the education and care of little Albert. And Biddulph was having to kind of deal with the colonial logistics of organizing this payment. So not everyone is happy that Queen Victoria is doing this. I haven't even scratched the surface of what these kids must have felt. But even these colonial officials, as we can see, were not particularly pleased by the 1870s that this was going on. And this was definitely the case with Duleep Singh earlier on. Although I mentioned that Aberdeen and Phipps were behind her support for Duleep Singh, the Governor General who deposed Duleep Singh was furious that this was going on. So if we quickly go back to his the conversation about his status, whereas Aberdeen and others in British royal circles appeared to view all royal blood as equally blue, as the saying goes, Dalhozi took a very different view of the Maharaja's credentials. And as we can see from this quote, he differentiated between Western, British aristocratic blood and Eastern blood, which he said that Duleep Singh had, and which he clearly views as being of an inferior quality to that of Europeans. And despite him crediting the Maharaja for supposedly improving himself by embracing Christianity and British modes of education, he did not feel that Duleep Singh could ever equal a British gentleman in dignity or sincerity. And he repeatedly attempts to impress the Queen with his views in this personal correspondence, but to no avail. And he was deeply annoyed at the grandiose hospitality that Duleep Singh received within royal residences, seeing this as actually being subversive to his own authority as the Governor General of India. Now, what I find quite interesting is that the dimensions of this debate about the meanings of blood, courtly status, and imagined forms of royal kinship fit quite interestingly with ideas propounded by Gil Anijdar in his book Blood. And again, I welcome anyone's thoughts on this. I've found it useful for thinking through these ideas, but if anyone's got criticisms or suggestions of other things I should read, please let me know. Now, Anijdar has encouraged, has encouraged scholars of race and religion to especially consider blood in its discursive iterations as a historical category of analysis in itself, which precedes, undercuts, and connects these two categories, which are otherwise widely perceived as being separate. He states that the very distinction between race and religion is an effect of an historical reconfiguration in Western Christian thinking from the Middle Ages onwards, which spawns the idea of the existence of different kinds of blood and lineages, each of varying quality or purity. He also demonstrates how within this milieu in which supposedly old Christian blood was being differentiated from that of new Christian converts or heathens, and he particularly bases this on early medieval Spain and the Inquisition, and then Europe more broadly. But how this differentiation was being made between old Christian blood and new Christian converts or heathens, that a new idea of blue blood or sangre azul emerged as European royalty and aristocracy attempted to discursively maintain supremacy over a wider Christian populace. Now, I'm not a medievalist, I'm not an early modernist, but what I found interesting and he goes on to trace, how these ideas then take form into more modern periods of history. I find it interesting in some respects how Duleep Singh's royal lineage and embrace of Christianity, the ways in which they're emphasized in the aforementioned courtly questions, might show how Anujdar's ideas are quite relevant to the study of 19th century transnational dynastic elites, and how they might help us to see that the nature of social hierarchies in relation to Britain's empire were actually much more complex and nuanced than, say, imperial histories such as David Canadyne's ornamentalism have perhaps portrayed in the past. And in relation to the topic at hand, I think this example demonstrates that royal and dynastic figures, as I mentioned, had their own ideas about how such social hierarchies should be made to work in their favour, and that British royalty in this period was particularly interested in being relatively flexible with who of different colours of different parts of the world could be included within the boundaries of their familial and courtly circles. But okay, as I try and wrap this up and kind of bring it to a close, why were they so interested? I think we have to recognise that in this period, monarchical and dynastic rule was increasingly being challenged on a number of fronts around the world. It wasn't just Indian and other native rulers from across the global south who had seen their power over their kingdoms shaken by Europeans. As I mentioned, in early 19th century Europe, the traditional authority of monarchy was being increasingly questioned by those who were keen to introduce more democratic reform. At home in Britain, Victoria and Albert were concerned by the threat of Chartism and the arrival of pro-republican revolutionary exiles from the continent into the country, as well as the growth of Irish radicalism and an increasing number of assassination attempts on their own lives. I don't feel sorry for them necessarily, but these are some of the challenges that they were facing and perhaps were contributing to this worldview. I think it particularly made it all important for Victoria and Albert to absorb information about European and global and imperial politics in this context from as many independent sources as possible. And diverse royal friends and networks were key to shaping Queen Victoria's political understanding, to which she and Albert remained consistently keen to maintain easy and relatively private access. So what I'm talking about in terms of these interpersonal relationships is what I would suggest is an expansion on what the historian Walter Arnstein has pointed out about how Victoria leveraged her family relations throughout Europe as an unofficial intelligence network that sometimes gave her information much faster than her foreign office. Above all, though, I think what's also going on here is a bigger attempt being made to present the Victorian court as a generous host and a wise instructor to deposed foreign royalty, which is redolent with political symbolism and was meant to demonstrate to the world the stability of the British royal family's rule, the monarchy and the family, constructing them as a family, at the head of its own empire, and marking therefore a stark contrast to the more tenuous positions of European and other global dynasties of their time. And again, the timing and nature of Victoria's supposedly open door policy to royals from around the world is key here. And I just want to briefly allude to this new book that's come out alongside Laura Clancy's book, Secret Royals, which is all about the British royal family from Queen Victoria's period up to the modern day and their engagement with intelligence, secret intelligence and surveillance. It's no coincidence really that what they argue essentially is that the British royal family, that they're two scholars of international relations and intelligence studies, and what they're really, fascinatingly argued is how the British royal family from Victoria's period onwards become actively involved and engaged with the collection of surveillance, with use of intelligence for policing, but also for the increasing control of borders and refugee movements into the country, and how I really felt they could have gone much further with this. Essentially, how they make the case that, of course, although Britain supposedly had an open door, very liberal, very tolerant policy towards refugee welcomes into this country from across Europe in this period, how it became increasingly selective, and how the royal family became increasingly connected with policing to keep an eye on these more radical revolutionary exiles, political exiles and dissidents from different parts of the world who were coming into Britain, and who initially perhaps welcomed quite openly, but who they increasingly did not want coming, because of course it threatened dynastic rule in different parts of Europe as well as in Britain itself. And so questions start to begin to be risen about who should be welcome in this country, but also who should be subject to policing and surveillance. And so, it's no, and others have argued, Caroline Shaw, Aidan Forth, about how imperialism becomes implicit in all of this too. And then going back to Laura's book at the beginning, she also traces the rise of what's known as now today the family firm, the monarchy as a corporation, to Queen Victoria's reign, because it's in this era that we essentially see the British monarchy being much more solidly represented as a royal family, which we're very, familiar with today, rather than as a sovereign, very powerful monarch. This shift to a sense of soft power in its public representation and its domestication is nevertheless not necessarily coinciding with a diminution of power. What I've actively tried to say today is there's a lot more fluidity in the political power of the royal family and how it's being exercised. And actually, I think I'm going to skip past a couple of slides because I've probably over talked a little bit, but how this particular royal family, how it incorporates these young, royal figures from around the empire, Black and Asian and African and Australasian characters into their royal family network is really, really key. So, sorry, my screen's just gone a bit crazy there. I'll pause there for a second. I can come back into talking about this imperial family dynamics much more, but I don't want to dive into too much detail now. I want to save some more time for questions. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Brilliant, Priya. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I'm sure others like me have been frantically scribbling all the way through. I've got lots of questions, and I will certainly be thinking about abusing my chair's position to pose some of them. I think one of the main things for me that I'm taking from your talk today is thinking about this question of categories and how it's and how these categories are determined. So in thinking about my own work, that idea of status that's embodied through blood is really interesting when we kind of move through to a 20th and 21st century understanding of kind of immigration control through race. It made me think of Sivanandan's commentary about wearing passports on our faces. But in this case, thinking about your passport in your blood, I just think it's a really interesting way of thinking about that, as well as this kind of contrast between guests or people who are being patronized versus kind of hostages and captives, and what this does to think about ideas of protection and sympathy and generosity, all of which are kind of claims that we can later see happening with the welcoming of less elite displaced people in the 20th century. So those were sort of some initial thoughts for me that kind of really came from this paper. So I hope it's generated similar for other people. I maybe want to start a little bit. I'll kind of pose the first question while people are thinking and gathering their thoughts together. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about where you see the role of gender within this collective, because I do think it's really interesting that Queen Victoria starts with these two young girls and then moves to kind of male wards in this context, and whether that's kind of precipitated by the gender of the babies that are born, so who is having the babies and when, or whether there's something more kind of strategic in thinking about which network she's playing and where she maybe sees the sort of futures for these political actors if she's trying to influence them.
No, thanks, Anna. Thank you for the lovely comments, and thank you also for all the amazing comments in the chat. I'm really tough because I was nervous about putting this all together and presenting it because my thinking is all over the place. But that's a really interesting question. I would say it's not that she's had two girls and she now wants a boy. It's and this is where I thought I just cut short on my slide. But if I go back to them quickly, I did have some thoughts on this. I mean, I think it's just that, you know, in many cases, it's only in the case of, I would say, you know, in many cases, it's Duleep Singh and Alamayu and Albert Victor where she kind of pounces in a way and actively pulls them into the network and into the court. As I kind of talked about with Duleep Singh and as I showed with Alamayu and Albert Victor. Gouramma and Sarah are brought into the royal court, and then she actively says, yes, I want to be involved in this, you know, whereas other past monarchs had not shown an interest in engaging with these kind of Asian and African royals to the same extent. George III definitely did. We know he was in dialogue. There's letters with various Indian Nawabs who were having really sticky time with the East India Company. And there's even one that supposedly appointed George III as executor of his will and named him as a father figure. So there's an interesting kind of maternal-paternal dynamic going on. But if I quickly return to my slides and just show you one of them. You know, with Duleep and Gouramma, and this was a chapter that I wrote about in my D4 thesis, the timing is really quite convenient because they're 4 years apart in age, and they're the only 2 Indian royal converts to Christianity, and she tries to matchmake them, right? She hopes to marry them off. And it's interesting because had she been successful, this would have been one of the very few matches between a northern Indian and a southern Indian dynasty. And she really tries to push them together. The same British kind of surrogate family act as the Logans, act as guardians for both of them. It doesn't work. They don't like each other in that way. And Duleep Singh's quite snooty about poor little Gouramma, to be quite honest. But this is all part of some of the arguments. It's connected to some of the arguments that have been made by the kind of cultural historian and theorist Margaret Homans about how, you know, in representing the royal family, the monarchy as a royal family, Victoria to an extent is giving her power, you know, showing, keeping on to certain elements of power by appearing to give it away, appearing to act as this model mother, wife, queen of the nation, and domesticating her image and her power and kind of engaging with bourgeois ideas of domesticity and majesty at the same time, but also in some ways imposing these gender norms on these young royal figures, right? And encouraging them to pursue these sort of domestic lives in some respects too. And you know, and you know, it goes down to the material culture here, the way these 2 are photographed, how these images are circulated publicly and privately. Duleep Singh and Gouramma, these photos become really popular, and they're circulated in various forms throughout the kind of burgeoning press at this time. But what's also interesting is that these 2 photos, as well as another one that I've got here of Sarah Forbes, were kept in the first ever royal family photo albums. So the Victoria and Albert were the early kind of adopters of photography, some of the first users of photography in the 1850s, and they made their own photo albums of the members of the family. And they've got, in these early albums that I had a look at Windsor Castle, they've got European family members, they've got their kids, they've got photos that Duleep Singh took of their kids while they were on holiday, which I thought was really intriguing, which obviously were never published, but they were there. And then they've got pictures of Duleep and Gouramma, it mingled in, and then later on their children from their respective marriages, mingling in with the kind of British royal family. And so for me, this is where this kind of sense of imagined kinship that actually gives life to Barbara Kane's arguments really comes from. But there's also this real instrumentalization that's going on publicly about, you know, representing who they are, what they, you know, what kind of status they enjoy in British society, and that relationship with the British royal family. And the fact that this marriage alliance is not successful is obviously really quickly hushed up, and it becomes imperative that Gouramma in particular and Sarah are seen to have good marriages. They're seen to be marrying into successful families or with a good husband, because otherwise that project that Victoria is trying to champion of her being the model queen, the model mother, would fail. And that's where the agency of these young kids is just totally trampled on sometimes. And it's really, really sad. And Gouramma actually tries to run away a couple of times. And in the end, some of her letters were burnt. You know, but the majority of her letters are burnt. And I've seen the little chit that Queen Victoria writes, where she orders them to be burnt. So there's a real gender dimension. Duleep Singh is kind of the good boy in this scenario, but Gouramma is the bad girl, and the bad brown girl in many respects too. She's very orientalized, very overly sexualized, and her letters are burnt as a result. So that's another reason why, you know, I can focus more on Duleep Singh, because his archive exists. Gouramma's is destroyed. So although she's kind of supposedly, you know, claiming them as equals, as royal blood, there's still these gendered and sexualized dynamics and partly racialized dynamics at play in the midst of all of this. So sorry, Anna, that was a bit of a long-winded answer to your question.
No, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. And I think thinking about like the performance of hospitality that you've sort of touched upon there, and how, you know, people have written about that during periods of decolonization, but to see its enactment here is really important. And then also thinking about places where we can see that agency, those attempts to run away. And it makes me think of Claudia Soares, who gave a paper on for this seminar 2 sessions ago, but he's written about child emigration in the same period, but of orphans and people in Bernardo's homes, but their kind of attempts to express agency too is very similar. We've got now some questions in the chat, and Chris has his hand raised. So what I might do is kind of ventriloquize the questions from the chat for you, and then get Chris to post his, and then we kind of take those 3 questions together, if that's okay and not too overwhelming. All right, so the first question is from Laura Clancy. So Laura, thanks so much for joining us, and great to hear more from you given the place of your work in this paper. So Laura has asked, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on how this plays out in more contemporary British monarchy history. So very different framing, but for example, the way Meghan Markle was brought into royal court when it suited them and then forced out when it suited them, and how this might intersect with these colonial histories. And John has asked, he says first of all that it's a really super thought-provoking paper, but his question is to do with the Prince Regent, a bit like Prince Charles today, waiting forever for the throne, who was also kind of travelling as a transnational royal through the empire almost as much as a modern royal. And Don wonders if you've seen anything in Victoria's papers to suggest he was a source of information. And just a little follow-up from Laura, she also is interested in hear what you thought of the film Victoria and Abdul, which we can maybe discuss too. Have you got a note of those? So Chris, do you want to come in with your question, and then we can let Priya tackle all those 3 at once?
Wow.
Chris, are you there? Okay. All right. Let's maybe start with those ones, and then Chris, if you want to come back. Oh, you're there. Brilliant.
I was muted. No, sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. So, yeah, I forgot to unmute myself. No, I was saying the first question has been okay. The other question I had has been asked already about, you know, the link between the contemporary and what was happening. So I won't go into that one. The second one is the name. So as I took question, the second one is the Sarah Bonetta Forbes. That's a very foreign name. Yes, African. What happened for her to be given that name? Was that a plan to remove her from her identity? I don't know why she became known as Sarah Bonetta Forbes.
Thank you for that question. Okay, right. Where should I start? Was that everything? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I'll start with that one quickly. It's not. I think the name was given to her on the ship as she travels over to Britain by Captain Forbes. So Forbes is his surname. Bonetta was the name of the ship, and then Sarah was the name that they seemed to just give her as a pet name on the travels over. She definitely had a Yoruba name. It was Ina, at least, is one of the names that she uses. There's a few others that are escaping me now, which is terribly embarrassing, but I will look it up and I can let you know. But we know that she signs her name as Ina, and I hope I'm not pronouncing that terribly badly. It's spelled A-I-N-A, so let me know, anyone, if I've got that wrong. but I've only ever seen it written down, so I'm just going by the pronunciation that I can imagine. But yeah, that's one name that she uses on, I think it was her marriage certificate. So she's definitely, her whole name has been entirely anglicized, entirely effectively Christianized and colonized on board the ship that brings her to Britain. And we don't know loads and loads about Sarah, unfortunately, because again, her archival traces are quite limited. The one book that has been written about her is and I've got it. Hang on, I've got it on my shelf here somewhere. Walter Myers' book here, which is essentially a fictionalized account. But it was very lucky in that he managed to buy a stash of letters at an auction house in London on his travels and produced a novel out of it. And I don't know what happened to those letters. They were part of his estate when he died. So I want to track them down. There's really minimal information on her in the Royal Archives. So there's some massive gaps essentially in the stories that we have of these young figures, and gender really does play into them. So getting her voice is really difficult. But what has fascinated me is how recently there's been a trend towards, pre even the whole big resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, there's been increasing interest in Black Victoriana. And she is the absolute poster girl for this kind of stuff about, and we're seeing this now with the Bridgerton situation with Queen Charlotte, reimagining the world of the Georgian Victorian eras with Black aristocratic figures. Well, she's a real figure in all of this. And she moves to Nigeria. She's involved in aristocratic society in Lagos, in mercantile society in Lagos, but sadly little trace of her archival things. So we can't capture her agency as such, including a conception of her name. But we do have that with Meghan Markle, if I move on to her. So Laura, Laura, I've read some of your articles on Meghan, so I don't want to kind of, I find your analysis of her position really interesting. But for me personally, what do I think of that situation? I find it really intriguing. When I produced a bit of an epic Twitter rant about this at the time when her interview with Oprah Winfrey happened, her and Prince Harry's interview earlier last year. And what really struck me was that neither those two nor the wider media coverage of this had any awareness that that she was actually not really the first person of color to be associated with the royal family so closely. And that, when they were talking about history being repeated itself, it was all with reference to Diana's treatment by the media and the paparazzi and the family firm, as you so rightly call it, but not the recognition that this family had, it co-opted these young people from around the empire generations before. And that I find really intriguing because it kind of shows how the monarchy and the royal family gloss over their own history. They haven't got an awareness of it themselves. I can to some extent excuse Meghan Markle for that, but some things I think, I question how much she was really ignorant about the royal family when she married into them. But secondly, as it goes, as you say in your book, how the monarchy so far has successfully managed to represent itself as being above or disconnected from the murky politics of global inequality, and actually how easy it is for us all to get caught up in that myth. But the dynamics play out very similarly, and I talked about Gouramma wanting to run away. I flagged this, when I tweeted about this and started talking about this at the time. It's very similar to the way in which Gouramma's life and her movements and her image were controlled, leading her to want to run away, to what we have seen with Meghan Markle. So I can only hope that a greater awareness of this history will encourage us to rethink all of that, past and present, in a different kind of way. Meghan, the movie Victoria and Abdul, I watched it. It's entertaining, but as a commentary on empire, it was, it's entirely sycophantic the way that Abdul kind of is shown as worshipping Queen Victoria at the end of, particularly at the end of the film, as a commentary on the court and its politics. I thought actually it was quite interesting. You know, the life of an elderly monarch and the complexities of her court, actually I thought kind of were captured. I remember feeling that it was captured quite in an interesting, nuanced way in the film. But the relationship with India, again, it's this entirely servile, romanticized thing, and a lot of the politics, particularly with some of the other Indian servants who are implicated in various different networks, were really glossed over. And again, there's this, you know, this notion that Victoria comes to empire really late in her life, when really, as I'm trying to show, she's fascinated with it and actively engaged in it right from the outset in many respects. I mean, I'm talking about a significant chunk in the middle of her reign, but there's lots of work already been done to show that she and Albert are receiving dispatches and getting engaged with imperial politics and policy making and correspondence pretty much within the first 2 to 5 years of her reign, once she's settled in and then once she's married to Albert, and then it just kicks into a high gear thereafter. So yeah, there's so much missing from the public discourse around the monarchy and the empire that we kind of need to connect up somehow. And lastly, the question about the Prince. Are we talking about the Prince of Wales, Albert Edward, Queen Victoria's son? Was that who you were?
Yeah, we are, because he went around the empire so much. I just wondered whether he was a line of intelligence for her, just in any general sense.
You know what? That's a really good question, and it's actually not one that I have thought about enough, because from what I have always seen, she didn't think very highly of her son and heir, for one, and she didn't fully appreciate the role that he played in doing those kind of tours. It was almost set up as a way to keep him out of trouble and on the move, so that he couldn't be involved with mistresses and scandals in the UK. And she blamed his involvement with a prostitute for the death of her beloved Prince Albert in the first place. But I think in a way, from my it's something I need to delve into a little bit more. But my understanding of it to this point is that she found it very useful. She, you know, as a means of him representing the monarchy around the empire for the first time. And it's very useful for, of course, the heir to the throne to build that global image and a sense of his own personal prestige. But what is clear is that because their personal relationship was quite fraught, the communication between mother and son was lacking. So, I mean, a prime example of that is when the prince, Bertie, as he was known to the royal family at that time, when he's on tour in India in the 1870s, is when Queen Victoria's change in title to Empress of India, or Kaiser-e-Hind, as the weird title they give her, was announced in 1876. He was still on tour. He'd been on tour for several months up to that point. No one told him that this was going to happen, right? But then with about a month or so before it was all going to kick off, and he was going to have to go to the Imperial assemblage and act on behalf of his mother, various Imperial assemblages, sorry. Then was he told that actually your mother's been awarded this title now by Parliament, and obviously that was going to pass on to him, right, as the next king. And he was furious that why has no one told me about this, so or even consulted him on the proceedings. So some of this is just really awkward family dynamics and missed opportunities. But of course, you know, Queen Victoria never leaves Britain to go around the empire. It is her sons and children that do it for her. So it's all grist of the mill in some respects, and she actively encourages them to do so. But weirdly enough, I mean, I will look into this, but I think my hunch is that the weird family dynamics between them meant that actually he was less of a source of information than someone like Duleep Singh was.
Yeah, very interesting. Of course, the fact that he didn't know anything about the Empress of India title is probably down to Disraeli more than the Queen. You know, because that was a piece of politicking by him. She was asking for it for a while, and he decided the moment was right for it. So birth of the modern monarchy, we've seen its slow recession ever since, maybe through the Commonwealth and so on. No, it was a great paper. You know, her kids do travel, but it's also important to think that lots of very very serious people travel with them as chaperones. It's not just them that go. So when the kind of I think it's Alfred who's he's a young prince. He's not regent because he's not next in line. But I think the Fenians threatened to try and kill him in Canada and Australia. And the people behind them, the sort of pretty serious, military types and civil servants who travel with them, would also be quite interesting. There might be some quite interesting correspondence with them. But I mean, it's a really interesting paper, and I think it's, it fits into the birth of the modern monarchy, the global monarchy, and the fact that she managed it from various estates, in England and Scotland, and only actually visited Ireland for a very brief tour of non-famine struck parts of Ireland in 1849. Yet she was Empress of India, but never went there, never went anywhere else apart from between Cork and Dublin, sticking to the coast and avoiding the misery that you saw in the illustrated news. So very interesting character, and it fits really well with a very big picture about the sort of the onion that is the empire, with the state and the country somewhere in the middle of it. And I think it's really important, and I think these networks of communication are actually really valid. And I think it absolutely, you asked the question, I think it absolutely is migration history, global history, international cultural history, call it whatever you want, so that people don't dismiss it as being somehow, an appurtenance, because it isn't. Really good paper. Really enjoyed it, as you can probably tell from what I'm saying.
Thank
really
you.
Thank you very
and
much.
I appreciate it's just scratching the surface. There's so many more questions to ask. It's too much for one person alone, to be quite honest. I'm hoping others will join me on the bandwagon.
No, they will. I'm sure they will. You'll inspire them to write about various different princes and princesses and whatnot. Yeah,
Thank you.
Good. Really good. Thank you.
Thanks.
Brilliant, thanks, Don. Priya, we have a question from Petra in the chat, and actually just building on something that Don said, I have one more question to squeeze in, and then we'll let you go and have your dinner and relax after giving us so much today. So Petra's asked how much is known about Prince Alamayu, and actually connected to him and thinking about Don's remark about chaperones. My question is kind of thinking about what movement was permitted to these royal wards once they'd been kind of brought into this kind of collective. So you mentioned that Alamayu spent time in India, for example, and that Sarah Bonetta Forbes returns to Nigeria. Is that, I think, after her marriage? So I'm just interested to know how much freedom of movement royal blood actually got you in this period, and how far these visits were chaperoned in thinking about that kind of British patronage, keeping an eye on them. So yeah, a last kind of couple of questions for you. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Well, there is quite a bit known about Alamayu and his family, and I cannot take the credit for that. So my colleague Christian Crouch at Bard College or Bard University in New York State is, as I mentioned in the talk, producing a book on this, and that's going to be called Queen Victoria's Captives. And that looks not only at Alamayu himself, but his entire family and some of the material culture that was captured from the Abyssinian Empire after the Magdala campaign, when the whole state was taken over. So thank you, Anna, for sharing Christian's details. She's done some really great online lectures that are available to watch that dive into Alamayu's story quite fascinatingly, and you automatically see the parallels between what I talked about with Duleep Singh and what happened to Alamayu. So she's another co-conspirator on some of this Royal Imperial history research, and I've been working closely with her to try and maybe develop some public engagement responses to this kind of and activities around this history. So watch out for that in the next few years. And then Anna, your question about the freedom of movement for these figures. Well, just one thing to add is most of them die quite young. So they don't live long enough to move around the world quite significantly in some respects. Gouramma dies age 23, Alamayu age 18. Albert Victor, we don't know what happens to him. He goes back to New Zealand with his parents, as I mentioned. His dad unfortunately runs off. He's taken into kind of missionary care in schools paid for by Victoria. And I will find out on the 6th of April when I next visit the archives, what happens next, because I believe there's some sort of plan for him, obviously, when he leaves school. But the kind of understanding is that he may have joined the Navy and potentially died in a shipwreck, because nobody knows where he went or how he died. But that's the basis of the understanding. But the broader question is, they were heavily, their movements were controlled, quite heavily controlled. So as they were young children and then early, teenagers essentially, they are kept under the care and essentially the control of state appointed or royally appointed foster families, all of them. And they monitor their movements, they monitor their education and their kind of progress in sort of very Victorian cultural terms, and meddle in their marriage making and that kind of stuff as well. So the kind of royal blood aspect gives them the privilege of this high standing in society and the maintenance of their titles and these pensions that then support them to live in quite a comfortable position in life, and to attend all sorts of glamorous events, from royal weddings to state receptions and all sorts, essentially, and to be seen in some respects as pillars of their migrant communities in the UK. So for example, like Duleep Singh, he is a massive donor to and the person who opens the home for strangers and Asiatics in London, which you guys might be familiar with. He's the guy that does that, and he invites the royal family there as honoured guests to be witnesses to all of this. So they occupy a very distinguished and superior position to other migrants in the country. But if anything, to an extent, they enjoy less freedom. So yeah, they're okay to go on holiday across Europe and be represented as royals. Alamayu goes to India, but it's because he is taken along with his guardian, Captain Speedy, who was essentially looking after him while doing a colonial post. And it was thought that it would be more conducive to Alamayu's health to send him to a tropical climate rather than keeping him in Britain. So again, there's these kind of colonial ideas about health and their lifestyles that are imposed on them. But he's not allowed to go anywhere near Africa, right? Duleep Singh, for example, is not allowed to go back to the Punjab at all. And he's able to move back there to just meet his mother for the first time and also perform her funeral, but not anything else. And by the 1880s, this leads to a massive problem because he becomes increasingly disaffected and then goes on this incredible rebellion against the British government. So he's more loyal than loyal throughout most of his life in living in the English countryside and kind of lapping up the more privileged side of this relationship. But it's a double-edged sword because Victoria encourages him to see himself as royal, his lifestyle begins to outstrip the pension that he was kept on by the British state. And he is continually drip-fed ideas about what he's entitled to from the British Royal Court and other areas of his life and his family. And that eventually leads to a deeply unhappy, disaffected person who, as Don mentioned, actually, he gets linked up with Irish Fenians and various others to then launch a rebellion against the British government in India and in Moscow and all sorts of stuff. And obviously that involves him throwing off the treaty that was imposed on him in 1849, which Victoria interpreted liberally, but also had a hard edge to it about his movements. And so within the debates about how to treat with Duleep Singh at that point, you really see this all come to the flash about, should he be seen with sympathy because he's this displaced royal elite and he knows nothing else, or should he be treated as a traitor or as a political dissident that needs to be stopped in his tracks? And really, there's as I kind of mentioned in the paper, there's no unity within the British governing elite about how to treat these figures and how to interpret their treaties and how to then manage their movements. It remains fluid and it remains contested all the way through. And so that gives some of these characters room for maneuver and room slightly to live this very privileged life. But it was always on a double-edged sword, because of course if you step out of line or you start to express an overly independent view of what you should be entitled to, then you're immediately going to be cut down. So it's complicated and messy, basically, is the short and sweet answer to that.
As all migration history often is. All right, Priya, I think let's leave it there because it's 6:25. It just leaves me to thank our wonderful speaker, Priya Atwal, again, and to remind you all for our upcoming seminar. Maybe just put the link in the chat. So the last session will be on the 27th of April, when Daniel Renshaw is presenting a paper on humanitarian and exterminatory elements of discourse on removal and repatriation in modern Britain. So I hope that many of you will be able to join us then. And thank you once again for being a fantastic audience this evening and for your attention to Priya's talk. Take care and have a good evening.